Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I think I'll give it just a minute more for any last minute sign-ins, and then we'll get started. Well, hello, good evening, and thank you all for being here. I'm Teresa Hanley. I'm the program director or project director for the Toward Peace Project. And on behalf of the Mission Inn Foundation, I want to thank you for joining us these last few weeks for Riverside and the World, History and Memory of Peace and War. This is our speaker series, as many of you know. That is a featured element of our project Toward Peace, which explores the peace activism of Mission Inn founder Frank Miller, as well as its legacy for us today. If this is your first time with us, welcome. And I want to let you know that the previous presentations have been recorded. If you go to the Mission Inn Foundation's website, missioninmuseum.org, all one word, you'll find the links to those presentations. We are very proud that Toward Peace is made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can visit calhum.org to learn more about them and the many fine programs they support throughout California. I would also like to thank our local sponsors, Judith Oth, Sally and Chuck Beatty, Kathy Wright and Dwight Tate, and Walter Parks. Tonight, I wanted to also take this opportunity to let you know that the Mission Inn Museum and Store reopens to the public tomorrow, and that tours of the National Historic Landmark Mission Inn, led by our award-winning docent crew, will begin again on April 13th. Jared tells me that there is a little incentive. Anyone purchasing over $20, I think it was, worth of things from the museum store will receive a free mask for safe museum visiting. So as we are coming to the end of this extraordinary time of COVID-19, I hope you will keep the Mission Inn Museum and Store in mind for unique purchases and leisure time activities. Now would be a really excellent time for us all to renew our support for the foundation and all it does to ensure that the historical and cultural significance of the Mission Inn remains a vital element of our community life. So now I just want to do a little quick Zoom housekeeping. Many of you are familiar with this, but in case anybody is new, we have muted the audience microphones and disabled audience cameras. This enhances the overall presentation. We have also disabled the chat function. So if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on your taskbar. Our speakers will address them following the presentation. Tonight's presentation, Peace and Equality, a Century in the Making, a conversation with Mona L. Siegel, is a new format for our series. Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes will interview Dr. Siegel about Dr. Siegel's recent book, Peace on Our Terms, The Global Battle for Women's Rights After the First World War. Let me tell you a little bit about our presenters. Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes is a professor of U.S. history at California Baptist University, where she teaches U.S. history from the colonial period through the Cold War. Her research explores the imaging of race and its impact on popular culture, and she has lectured about the politics of American popular culture at universities worldwide, including the National University of Rwanda, the Beijing Academy of Social Sciences, and UNAM in Mexico City. She has served as a gubernatorial appointee to California Humanities, the state branch of National Endowment for the Humanities. In 2019, Professor Davis Hayes served as a Gilder Lehrman Institute lead scholar where she trained public school teachers in in-depth content knowledge regarding women's suffrage movement, antebellum civil rights efforts, and the relevance of Alexander Hamilton in modern society. She is currently writing a book about the, pardon me, she's currently writing a book about the history of Black women on television during the civil rights era. We are pleased to welcome back Dr. Mona Siegel, professor of history at California State University, Sacramento, who was with us a few weeks ago to profile three leading women peace activists with connections to Frank Miller and the Mission Inn. Tonight, we will hear more details about her research on women peace activists, with particular emphasis on the years after World War I. To remind us of some of Dr. Siegel's scholarship, she has published on such topics as Western feminism and anti-imperialism, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom's anti-opium campaign, for which she was awarded the 2011-12 De Benedetti Prize in Peace History. And this was a little off topic, but I couldn't resist this title. History is the opposite of forgetting, the limits of memory and the lessons of history in interwar France, published in the Journal of Modern History. It is my honor to introduce to you Professors Kenya Davis Hayes and Mona Siegel. There they are.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Teresa. Mona, I'm so glad to see you. I've been really excited about this conversation. And good evening, all. We're always so glad that you are joining the Mission Inn Foundation to join us in this exploration of peace in the post-World War I era. Dr. Mona Siegel wrote an incredible work entitled Peace on Our Terms, The Global Battle for Women's Rights After the First World War. And hopefully all of you will get a chance to purchase this book. I'm not saying this because I am biased, but I have to say it is one of the best texts that I have read about the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. And it traces the impact and the participation of women in the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. And she does it monthly, looking at each chapter, a new wave of women from a different part of the world arriving at the peace conference and making an incredible impact. So if you get a chance, please pick up the book. And I cannot wait to chat with you, Mona, about your writing experience and what you learned about women and peace and suffrage post-World War I. So we're going to dive right in. Your book traces the impact of women suffragists and liberationists on the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. It also explores the impact of the conference on their various existing efforts all over the world. And so I have a two-part question for you.
Okay.
Why was the Peace Conference such a galvanizing event for women's activism? So that's A. And B, can you articulate women's roles and impacts on the Paris Peace Conference in general?
Absolutely. So thank you, Kenya, so much. It's really an honor to get to have this conversation with you, whom I admire very much. And this book that I wrote, Peace on Our Terms, is unusual in some respects in that the vast majority of the action in the book happens in 1 year, right? I wrote a whole book on 1 year. And I mean, there's the, pre-story and the afterword, but and that year is 1919. And the reason that year is so important is because of the Paris Peace Conference. This was an event that catalyzed women's activism, not just here in the United States, where we might be somewhat familiar, or even in Europe, but truly all over the world. And so that the first part of that question that you asked me is kind of like, why the peace conference? I mean, this was a bunch of stuffy male diplomats getting together in stuffy meeting halls in Paris. Why did women think that this was a moment in which their needs might be addressed and in which they might have a say in what a peaceful world order was going to look like going forward? And the answer to that question, both it has to do with the peace conference itself, which I'll say in a moment, but it also has to do with the world war that the world had just exited. I mean, Jennifer got us started at the very beginning of this whole Toward Peace discussion, thinking about World War I, the tremendous impact it had globally, and the many ways it's still relevant for us today. And that World War, as she talked about, transformed women's lives in many respects, particularly in the belligerent countries. In Europe, where women were called upon to serve their nation in ways they had not before, particularly economically, stepping into new roles. But it wasn't just that they were being asked to do this work, is that they were told that this was vital work for national survival. And for the first time, many women, not just politicized women and suffragists, many women began to think of themselves not only as mothers or sisters or somehow attached to men, but as independent actors in their own nation, and to think of themselves as potential full citizens. So that experience in the war mattered, particularly in Europe and in the United States and the British Commonwealth. It was also true, though, that the war affected women in far-flung corners of the world that we might not think about, places like West Africa and Egypt, where in some cases men were actually going off to fight or being conscripted as laborers, and the absence of those male laborers and their homes affected women drastically. Sometimes inflation went through the roof, and so for women who needed to put bread or grain or whatever it was on the family table, their lives became all the more stressful. And so women way removed from even the field of battle began to feel invested in what this final peace would eventually look like. So that's part of it. It was the kind of rising expectations during the war itself. And then the peace conference, right? As Woodrow Wilson and other male global leaders began talking during the war about what was going to be on the table, it was clear that they were not just interested in gathering to negotiate and end a war, although that was important. They needed to determine the terms by which people would permanently lay down their arms, but they were looking to the future, right? Woodrow Wilson, as you well know, when he called on Americans to support this war effort, said the reason they should is because the war must be made safe for democracy. And American women certainly, but women all over the world latched onto those words and said, absolutely, but your world can't be made safe for democracy if that democracy excludes half of the adult population of the world. And Woodrow Wilson also said that part of this peace process was going to ensure that the weak were heard as well as the powerful, and that parts of the world that did not have autonomy would be able to exercise national self-determination. And that language mattered to women too. They said, how can a nation have self-determination if the individuals within that nation can't determine the laws under which they're governed? And so this rhetoric that was carried in newspapers and talked about around kitchen tables influenced how women began thinking about the peace. And so when the end of the war came and those plans for the Paris Peace Conference began very, very quickly, women were ready to act, and they did. And so they began demanding that this be a peace in which they have a voice over its eventual terms.
I think it's so interesting that you're talking about the impact of war on women's lives. I'm always telling my students that, at least from an American context, regardless of the war, war changes women, war changes minorities, right? And quite often these demographics seek to use war, their efforts on the home front if you're a woman, the efforts on the battlefield if you are a person of color, to change their experiences and their dynamics at home. And so it is fascinating that these women all over the world, wealthy women, as you were saying, working class women, women outside of the quote unquote Western world, are latching on to this war and saying, we've done the following. We have fought, we have suffered, or we have just heard the rhetoric of this war, and we demand better. And so I was really moved as I read your book that as these disparate women descend on on Paris, right? That they start to have these internal conversations, and I think it raises For me, another interesting question for you, that your book is so clear about how these conversations in democracy vary based on class, race, and nationality. And so while all of the women that you cover are suffragists in some way, that they are women's liberationists in some way, they're also very much so influenced by their race, class, and nationality. And I was just wondering if you could share with the audience how that complicated their efforts in Paris in 1919.
Absolutely. So women were galvanized in different ways and for different reasons. So I guess I'm realizing I never even answered part 2 of your initial question, which was kind of like, what did women do when they got to the peace conference? So let me kind of talk about one group of women, the ones who were kind of really there at the doorstep of the peace conference, who were mostly white, wealthy Western women. Look at what they were doing, and then answer this question about race and class and nationality and religion and all the other things that got wrapped up. Is that okay if I tackle
Please. Yes,
it that way? So when it was announced, I mean, everyone knew a peace conference was coming. When it was announced, it was going to start in January 1919. It was going to be in Paris. The most organized women in the world, who were all white and Western, and especially British and American, they immediately began writing letters and getting on the telephone and demanding entry into the White House, and asking Woodrow Wilson, asking David Lloyd George to appoint women to the peace delegations that were going to be sent to this conference. They said women need to be represented at the peace table. And perhaps, unsurprisingly, in retrospect, they either were all ignored or they were told no. So women had a lot of trouble getting their foot in the door. And in fact, as my book talks about, only one allied country in the world actually seated a woman on its official peace delegation. And that woman, or that country, was China. The woman was named Su Mei-chung, or Cheng Yushi, her given name. And she was sent over to Paris by the nationalists in China to help represent Chinese women and to serve as a liaison. So she had a foot in the door from the inside, and we can return to her at some point. But for white Western women who were so convinced that they needed to have a say and that women's rights needed to be part of the discussion, they had to work from the outside in. And so my book opens in January 1919 with white Western women, and particularly with French women who were right there on the scene, seeing how quickly everything was evolving. And these French women, led by a woman named Marguerite de Witt-Schlumberger, invited Allied suffragists to Paris so that they could demand representation and make sure that women's rights were addressed. And so some of the most prominent suffragists in the world managed to get themselves to Paris at the very end of this war. And they opened their conference in February, and they kept at it for 2 months straight. They had multiple direct meetings with Woodrow Wilson, with the peacemakers. They were eventually allowed to testify before several of the peace commissions. And while they had a whole wide range of demands, some may seem more gendered than others. I mean, on the broad level, one of the things they demanded, which we might think about in this time of COVID, was the establishment of what would eventually be called the World Health Organization. They thought that public health needed to be regulated on an international level because they had experience as nurses and some of them as doctors, and they knew how important that was. And then they wanted suffrage as a precondition of even joining the League of Nations, right? Women's suffrage, universal suffrage. So white Western women were there from the beginning. They were there at the doorstep. Some of them were pretty well connected. They managed to get their foot in the door. But they represented a very small sliver of women across the world. And interestingly, this group of women, when they were allowed to testify before the League of Nations Commission, they said, we don't want to speak just for ourselves. We want to speak for all women. And I don't have their exact language on the edge of my tongue, but they more or less said, we want to be able to speak for the women who are truly oppressed by the barbarous customs of other parts of the world. And to them, that really meant the Arab world. It meant the Orient, to use their terminology. It meant the Far East, women who they thought were incapable of speaking for themselves. And it's ironic because women were increasingly, and in this moment, particularly able to speak for themselves. And, as I said already, the only woman actually on a peace delegation who had that representative power was Chinese. Egyptian women were rising up alongside Egyptian men against British colonialism, but to demand democracy, universal democracy for men and women alike. And Pan-African women as well, African-American from the United States, but with a kind of Pan-African agenda, arguing for racial justice as well as sexual equality. And so where this complicates the picture, which is really the important and core question that you asked me to begin with, is while these women could all agree on the importance of suffrage, on the ability of women to have a voice and to help shape the laws that mattered most to them varied tremendously based on their personal experience, right? So where working class women cared very much about the unequal pay and exploitative labor conditions, and that was really what needed to be addressed at the core. African American women who were suffering just incredible racial violence at the end of World War I in 1919 and had experienced it their whole lives, were very, very concerned about Jim Crow and racial segregation and inequality. And that was the reason for focusing so much on getting women's voices heard. And women who lived in the colonial world had another separate agenda, and all of these revolved around questions of self-determination and democracy. So they could speak the same language, but they were not necessarily emphasizing the same subjective conditions of oppression.
I think another piece of your book that's stuck out to me as well in terms of looking at the diversity of women is how there was a very clear sort of hierarchy of expectation, right? That there would be moments that these women from very different backgrounds would interact. And there would be, and that at times you would have, let's say, elite white women who would sort of slight, these other women. So here they were in Paris in 1919, and they were, discussing democracy and they were discussing equality. But then there would be moments of like, well, but I'm thinking about Mary Church Terrell, who was not invited to go with a delegation of white women to visit the battlefields in Belgium, I believe, and how she sort of had to push for that. And they kind of demurred to speak out, for her participation. I was struck about how Sune Ching, the woman journalist whose name, I'm thinking her name was Tuli, maybe, was very shocked that she could speak English and French, and she was so fashionable and her feet weren't bound. And so I think that even, of course, we could even see in our own sort of political landscape that sometimes there can be sort of a shared root philosophically, but then when there are interactions of diverse people, that things can kind of go astray. So that really struck me.
Yeah, actually, if I can, maybe it's worth telling Mary Church Terrell's story just a little bit here, since I know most of the people who've joined us tonight probably haven't read my book. Hopefully you've heard of the name Mary Church Terrell in this, or at the end of this year, where we've just been celebrating women's suffrage. She was probably she was one of the most prominent African-American suffragists of the early 20th century. You might have caught her name when Kamala Harris accepted the vice presidential nomination. That was one of the women that she paid tribute to. So Mary Church Terrell, who was from Washington, D.C., and a Black women's club leader and a civil rights advocate and a suffragist, she was invited over to Paris by Jane Addams, so one of the women that Teresa and I spoke about, who has visited the Mission Inn, to join with peace pacifist-oriented American women. This was a separate conference from the one in Paris. It took place in Zurich, and it too was examining issues of a peaceful world order from a women's gendered perspective. And so Mary Church Terrell was invited to join the group by Jane Addams, whom she considered a friend. They traveled over on the boat together to Europe, and they were collaborating together. She actually shared a bunk, or not a bunk, but a room on a boat.
Earth.
A berth, thank you. Clearly I've never traveled, I've never taken a cruise. She shared a berth on the ship with Jeanette Rankin, the first female legislature. So she very much felt an equal member of this team that went over, but they got to Paris. They had a week or so before they needed to go down to Zurich for their conference. And they all wanted to visit the recent battlefields of the First World War. It may seem odd to you, but battlefield tourism was actually a big industry after the war. And it's because people wanted to tangibly understand this horrific event that had taken place far away and had so affected their lives. But that was a military zone, partially controlled by the American military, and the American military was segregated. And so these women who had embraced Terrell as an equal were now worried that an interracial party would not be welcomed or would cause a stir, and that would somehow embarrass Terrell. And so they went on this battlefield tour without her. And she was devastated. She was angry as all heck. She went and pursued an individual tour of her own, and I tell that story in my book. She was not a woman to be talked down to. But then when she went on to when she went on to Zurich with these peace women, Jane Addams and the others, she was permitted to put a resolution for potential adoption on the table of this conference. And with the American women said, sure, and then the International Committee said, sure. And this resolution was a racial equality resolution. It said, we as women who believe in peace and justice believe that nobody should be discriminated against based on race or creed. And the women at this conference unanimously adopted this. It became one of the founding statements of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is still the longest existing women's peace organization in the world today. And these were very radical women. They were committed to this idea. And yet, just 1 year later, in 1920, when everyone had come back home, a scandal arose that was generated from within Germany, which was partially occupied by French and Belgian troops. And some of those French troops who helped occupy the Rhineland in Germany were Black African troops. And German women and other German organizations raised the alarm bells. These men were behaving inappropriately. They were engaging in rape. And the German Fräuleins were not safe with these Black men who could not control their sexuality overseeing them. And so the WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, heard about these vulnerable white women, and their first impulse was to say, oh no, this is wrong. Black troops need to be pulled out of the Rhine. And British women in particular really signed on to this campaign. And but when Mary Church Terrell, when it began circulating in America and the American women were deciding whether or not to sign, Mary Church Terrell looked at this and she said, I cannot lend my voice or my name. Everything in my experience tells me that it is not white women who are vulnerable at the hands of Black men. It is Black women who for generations have been attacked and raped by white men. And, unless you have evidence to show me, I'd rather resign my position than sign on to this document. So even this very radical organization that on the surface, adopted this race resolution didn't live in the shoes of a dark-skinned woman in the United States and had to be really schooled in why this was so offensive.
Yeah, I was very struck by that section of the book because there was another chapter in which the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, you have women representing the Central Powers as well as the Allied powers, and they really had to build a bridge, right? And there was an issue about a food blockade, and there was starvation, and that there was a bit of a rift even amongst them. But then, as you say, then a year later, it's like, oh, these poor damsels in distress, right? Because some of these women weren't really fast to create links with women of the Central Powers. I mean, they do, right? But there's sort of a bit of a reticence there. But nothing brings you together than racist fear of imaginatory rapist Black men.
Right.
Um,
Well, it's true. And that was part of a deliberate campaign on some Germans' part to rehabilitate Germany, right? Germany had been the Huns during World War I, and now they were the victims of different barbarian types, right? And you're absolutely right that race served the role of flipping the idea of who the enemy was. And you know, it's disturbing when you watch it kind of unfold in the archives and in the documents. But thank goodness there were outspoken suffragists like Mary Church Terrell there, because ultimately, to Jane Addams' credit and the American Wolf's credit, they decided not to sign on to that document. But had Terrell not kind of laid out American history for them, I'm not so sure they wouldn't have gone with their gut instinct.
That's interesting. That's really, really interesting. And I think that creates an interesting bridge for my next question. Many of the women activists you write about highlight the atrocities of war, the real atrocities of war, to further their causes in peacetime. So can you explain how they weaved the horrid realities of war with the needs for a better society in peacetime?
Sure. And you know, a really important question in this this kind of ongoing conference where we're talking about peace and ideas about building peace. And I think what's interesting about many of these women who worked so hard to influence the ultimate peace terms in 1919 was that they were involved in the peace movement out of a true horror of war. And, you know, for women like Jane Addams and others who toured the battlefields, and Mary Church Terrell ultimately did tour the battlefields, right? They saw that devastation firsthand. Others, Marguerite de Witt-Schlumberger, the French woman who brought all those inter-allied women to Paris in January of 1919. She had 5 sons who served in the front lines in World War I, and she had 1 son who died in the war. So this was very real. The devastation of war was very personal to them. On the other hand, or not on the other hand, at the same time, these were women who deeply believed that war was a specifically male problem, right? The war, because virtually no women on the planet, or well, I shouldn't say no, a very, very small number of women on the planet had any political influence when this war broke out. It was cast by women as the result of male statecraft, right? This is what happens when men alone hold the reins of power. From their own experience, but also from their own kind of strategizing within the women's movement, they readily argued that women were more peace-loving than men. This came out of their role as mothers and nurturers of families as well as of nations. And so for them, emphasizing the horrors of war was a heartfelt matter, but it was also a strategic matter, right? Because then they could say, this is why you need to include us as full partners in the construction of a new world order. Because as long as men are able to dictate foreign policy, we're going to end up right back in the same place all over again. And so this kind of strategic maternalism, using the language of motherhood as an edge into opening the doors for women's voting, women as diplomats, women as public policy makers, all of this was a way of trying to get a foot in the door. And in one respect, it was very successful. They were able to get men's attention. On the other hand, though, it risked marginalizing them at the same time, because there was this idea among male diplomats out there that essentially women were too peace-loving to be trusted with peacemaking, right? They were too ready to give up the farm. They were too ready to step into the shoes of their neighbors and to understand the former enemy. And if you've got somebody like that at the negotiating table, well, how are you going to draw the line and protect your national interests? And so it worked for them in some respects, but it also worked against them in other ways too.
There was also, you mentioned, in terms of working against them, newspapers who depicted Jeanette Rankin of crying, right? That they were very emotional. And so the press, particularly for women who advocated for peace, really painted them as these hyper emotional women who cannot be trusted, because they can't think, pragmatically, let us say. And so I think it is interesting how you mentioned, on one hand, you see this rhetoric of being, maternal, of being, feminine, of being naturally moral as women. But then at times it worked against them, depending on, I would say, the whims of men in power. Sometimes they led them.
Absolutely. And I think they tried to play it both ways. They were pretty
Yeah.
savvy. They kind of knew who their audience was. And actually, to come back to kind of your question about race and also kind of colonialism and some of that, there was one very interesting moment that I talk about in chapter 1 of my book, when these women were kind of trying to decide on what issues they should emphasize with the peacemakers. And one day, an Armenian woman arrived kind of more or less at their doorstep. Armenia, of course, having just suffered this terrible genocide at the hands of Ottoman Turkey during World War I. And Zabel Yasayan is her name. She came and testified before these women and told the story, and said, really the peace conference needs to be rescuing young Armenian girls who were more or less sold into slavery into Turkish homes. And she told a very compelling story, and it was awful, many of the things she described. By the same token, these Western women very quickly came to realize that the white men who did not want to hear them talk about rights and equality were very interested in hearing about Christian women victimized by a Muslim nation. And they were even directly encouraged by one of the French diplomats to use that story. They said, tell that story to Georges Clemenceau, and then maybe you'll catch his ear. So it's just, there's like very real suffering that came out of this war, and that there's other people, there's other reasons to strategically emphasize some stories over others because they played in the ideological environment of the post-World War I period.
Indeed. I think that this is a really good bridge into just some broader questions, because I have to sort of keep track of time. This book is peopled with phenomenal women, right? And I feel like I have a list now of women that even I need to read up more about, because they are so very compelling. But of the many women you researched in your book, which did you find the most compelling? And of the historical figures that you were already familiar with, who did you grow to see differently over the course of your work?
So I both love this question and hate this question. It's been
Sure.
posed to me before, and I always feel like somebody's asking me to choose my favorite child. It's just like, it's a little heart-wrenching. But I will answer you, although I want to take this moment and just encourage those of you who are watching this to also put your questions in the Q&A. I really love hearing from all of you too, and I'm happy to build out some of the stories that I've been alluding to but haven't gotten to talk about so much. So my favorite person, my favorite kind of character in my own story is this Chinese woman, Shang Yuxie, who went by Su Mei Cheng in the West. She, of all the figures who I uncovered, when I began tracing out her story through the archives and through her out of publication memoir and all of this, I honestly didn't think she was for real. I had to call a Chinese feminist historian friend of mine in Australia and kind of say, okay, this woman says she did all this. Is it possible? Should I believe her? So just really briefly, because I really want you guys to read her story someday, because I can't tell it all here. Sume Chung was a child at the very end of the Qing dynasty in the late 19th century, born into a very wealthy family. Her dad worked for the Manchus who were in power. And she was expected to be raised as a upper class domestic lady, which in China at that time meant limited or no education and bound feet, and just preparing for a very limited domestic life. Sume Chung, at a young age, rebelled against all that. She threw such a temper tantrum when her grandmother tried to bind her feet that her grandmother gave up, said, "You're going to have feet like elephants. You'll never have a husband, but whatever." And so she rebelled as a child. When her family arranged a marriage with her with a man who did not believe in modern egalitarian marriages, she wrote him a letter himself and said, "I don't think I'm really very well suited for you. Perhaps you should look for somebody else." It was just this tremendous scandal, right? So she was a personal rebel from a young age. She attended an American missionary school for a short while in Tianjin in China. She convinced her father to let her go to Japan for a while, where she hooked up with Dr. Sun Yat-sen and became a revolutionary. She went back home and under her father's nose, without him knowing it, transformed their home into a revolutionary headquarters. And she began smuggling bombs for Sun Yat-sen into Beijing. So she was a revolutionary who helped overthrow the Qing dynasty. She was a suffragist who helped break windows in the parliament in China all the way back in 1912 to demand votes for women. And as I said earlier, she ultimately was the only woman appointed by her government in a kind of representative position at this peace conference. She then went on to become China's first lawyer, a female lawyer, China's first female judge, and to be in a position to help draft China's first modern civil code, bringing more or less equality to women in marriage. So she is extraordinary, but she hasn't just been forgotten in the West and in the United States, although she was very well known here. Good Housekeeping ran a multi-page spread on her in the late 1920s. And she would later be married to a man who became ambassador to the United States in the middle of World War II. So she had a public life here again in World War II. Anyway, she's been forgotten in the United States, but she's also been forgotten in China. And I should say deliberately forgotten in China, because while she was a nationalist, she was never a communist. And so after 1949, both she and her husband were persona non grata, and she actually died in Los Angeles in the 1950s. So she's extraordinary, and my favorite child, if I have to choose a favorite child. So, and you also asked of the women you knew of, well, kind of who surprised you most? I have to say, most of these women in the book were not familiar to me, or their name was familiar and absolutely nothing more. Jane Addams was probably the only woman in this book that I had read quite a bit about before embarking on this project. And I loved learning more about her, but I can't say anything surprised me a ton. Maybe just you and I have talked about this before, the fact that she was so miserable and isolated during World War I because of the pacifist positions she took, that I had not realized just what a difficult period that was in her life. But most of these women, Hoda Sharawi in Egypt, who we have not even had to talk about, and somebody put a question in the Q&A so I can talk about her. She led the Egyptian feminist movement. All of these women, one after another, I was, swallowed up by their stories.
I just want to thank you. We talked about Mary Church Terrell already, but I just want to thank you for humanizing her for me even more. And it's such a minor piece, but you have her passport picture.
Yeah. And
I've only seen her in these elegant portraits. And of course, there's a politic to the portraits of African Americans in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. But here she just looked like a person. She looked like someone who'd gotten off work, and she's got all these kids, and her mom is coming into town to take care of them while she's going to go to Europe, and she just looks tired. And I was like, I feel you, Mrs. Terrell. I do.
I know. I so wanted that picture in the book, and it is in the book. Her 1919 passport. First of all, passports weren't really used before World War I. I don't know how much people realize that. The very fact of having to get a passport was something new, so people held on to them. And her 1919 passport is in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And when I pulled it out of the box with all those stamps, letting her pass through military zones, I felt like I was on that journey with her. And when I saw that picture of her, it's the only time I've ever seen her with a hair out of place on her head. And me too, I was like, wow. But, she had days to get ready. And interestingly, when she went to that passport office to get her passport, the Wilp women, Jane Addams, they told her, bring your husband with you. Her husband was a judge, one of the few African-American judges at the time. Bring him to vouch for you, right? So, you get a sense of what it meant as a woman and as a Black woman to be traveling around the world at that moment in time.
I just want to thank you so much, Mona.
Oh gosh, my pleasure.
Your book was great.
Thank
I
you.
have enjoyed chatting with you. And now we're going to turn it over to Teresa for us to start to field, or for Mona to field questions from our participants.
Okay, here I am. And actually, we have a few questions, which actually Dr. Siegel has already addressed most of them, I think. So there is time for audience members to submit more questions. Please do. I'll keep watching those. So Dr. Siegel, someone had asked about the title of your book. So perhaps you could just reiterate the title and also tell us a little bit how the best way to find it, other than Amazon, I guess.
So I have it, of course, right next to me, right? So I can show it to you. I don't know if there's too much glare on the screen there. So the title is Peace on Our Terms, The Global Battle for Women's Rights After the First World War. And actually, I think it's coming out in paperback either tomorrow or the next day. It's supposed to come out in paper this week. So it's available at local bookstores, at bookshop.org. It's available on Amazon. You can order it directly from the publisher. It's pretty widely available. So you shouldn't have too much trouble finding it. And it's also available as an audiobook, I should say. And it is under contract right now. It's being translated both into Dutch and into French. So if you prefer to read in Dutch or in French, you'll have that opportunity in a year or so.
I'll ask a question and combined with a little bit of a comment, because your little discussion on the passport picture, I also saw the passport picture in the book and was sort of equally drawn to it, primarily because I haven't seen passports for Frank Miller or other family members, but I have seen the passport application from 1907 for their trip in 1907, which was when they were with Aletta Jacobs and visited The Hague. And the daughter, there is an application for Frank Miller, and there's an application for his unmarried daughter, Alice, at about 21 years of age. There's no application for his wife, Isabella, although she went with him. And so I'm really fascinated by the fact that Alice at 21 in 1907 had her own application in which she listed her occupation as hotel proprietress. And by the 1950s, when she was married, she apparently no longer had a name. And the document is her husband's document, and she's listed as wife.
Well, I was going to say, Teresa, I can solve the mystery for you, because in American, and definitely American and British, maybe other passports of that era as well, there was a whole page in a man's passport for the wife. And so if they were traveling together, then they just shared a common passport.
Yeah. But I thought it was just fascinating that there was literally no name. Her name was not listed, and this was in the 1950s, I think, or 40s maybe. So we do have some other questions. Let's see. So someone, Mona, is asking if you would spell Sume and say the last name for me.
Chung, yeah. So first of all, her given name is Zhang Yuxie, which I won't spell for you, because if you even just want to go into Wikipedia, if you search on Sume Chung, which is how she was known in the West, is how you'll find it. So Sume was Soumay, and Chung was Tcheng. So there is just a short entry for her in Wikipedia. Her memoir it took me a while to put this all together. Her memoir in English is published under her married name. So it's called My Revolutionary Years, The Memoirs of Madame Wei Tao Ming. Wei Tao Ming was her husband, who was ambassador to the United States. It's out of print, although my next project, if I can make it happen, is to convince a publisher to bring that back into print, because it is just absolutely an amazing story.
And you said she died in Los Angeles, and I had seen that, and I did actually, using your book for the English version of her name, do a search in the California digital newspapers just in case she had visited the Mission Inn, because it's not entirely, impossible that she might have.
Yeah.
But it's pretty difficult, the transliteration, obviously, but then also the way the transcription of the newspaper.
Yeah, she's hard to track through I mean, she is trackable through some of these historical databases, but they spell her name differently every third time. So.
And did she live in Los Angeles for a long time?
No, she and her husband, they'd been in the United States during much of World War II. She toured the country with Madame Chiang Kai-shek when she made that famous tour during the war. They returned to China at the end of World War II, and they were on Taiwan for a couple years, but they broke with Chiang Kai-shek after the Chinese Civil War. And they spent 5 or 6 years in South America, and not much is known of their life at that time. Brazil and Uruguay, it looks like, couldn't make it there. And then at some point in the early to mid 1950s, moved to Los Angeles. She had cancer at the end of her life. She had to have a limb amputated, and then she died. In fact, maybe you'll help me, Teresa. She's buried in Los Angeles somewhere. I don't know where, and I really want to visit her grave someday, but I don't know how to do that kind of research.
Yeah, you need a genealogist. They'll find it. So we actually, the questions are piling up here, so let me get to those. Rose Monhay asks, it seems that the American media undercut the efforts of the peace efforts led by women. How were these women portrayed in the press?
So, I mean, for the American women in particular, they were actually treated relatively respectfully in the press up until 1917, when America declared war. It started to change earlier, though. So I think you and I talked about this, maybe, Teresa, when we were talking about Jane Addams. When she came back from having visited Europe in 1915 for an earlier women's conference, seeking to bring about a negotiated end to the war, she had Jane Addams had given a speech saying these men were often given alcohol in order to steel their nerves before they went into battle. And with that, some of the conservative anti-suffragist press began to really turn against her. And then after America declared war in April of 1917, these women, these American female peace activists, were really incredibly isolated, if not outright mocked. And it was very difficult for them. And even still in the post-war period, they were either ignored or not given very positive coverage, except in the left-wing press, which looked at things quite differently. To come back to Mary Church Terrell for a second, she, after spending time in Paris and in Zurich, she went to London before she returned home. And I found a really moving letter from her in the archives in Manchester, where she was trying to reach out to British suffragists and said to them, first of all, she said, is anyone talking about this race resolution in the press that I raised? Has it gotten any coverage here in Britain? And do you think anybody would want an article from me or a story from me from a Black woman's perspective? And she kind of got a letter back saying, no, I mean, and it was framed as, we can't get anyone super interested in our efforts as female pacifists right now. But she faced, of course, that double burden as a Black woman too.
Thank you. hold on, I'm just looking through to see if there are any that need to be combined. So I think we'll try this one. Dwight Tate wants to know, what was the average age of women who attended the Paris conference?
So these were, for the most part, middle-aged women, or if not even a little bit older. Marguerite de Witt-Schlumberger was in her 60s when she went. I believe Jane Addams was as well. I mean, you know, for most women, they were, if they were tied down by children, you know, traveling or even engaging in street activism wasn't possible. One chapter of my book that we haven't talked about at all is the last chapter, where I talk about working class women and labor women, who, some of whom came to Paris initially in order to try and influence labor laws, as they were international labor laws, as they would come out of the conference. But then at the end of 1919, the first meeting of the International Labor Organization, the ILO, was held in Washington, DC. And in this case, people traveled in the opposite direction. They traveled from Europe and Asia and Latin America in order to try and influence labor laws for women. One of the most prominent British women who came over, her husband had just, she was, I believe, in her late 20s, early 30s. Her husband had just died of the Spanish flu. She had a baby in arms, and she brought that child over with her. And they traveled together in order to participate in the first International Conference of Working Women. A Japanese woman who I talk about in that chapter, who came over representing Japanese women, was pregnant at the time. And when she began making demands on behalf of protecting Japanese female silk workers that the representatives of the government and employers didn't like, they claimed that she was just deranged and out of her mind because she was pregnant and should be excluded from the conference altogether. So there were some women who were a little bit younger. Su Mei Chung was also in her 20s and attending law school when she was given this tremendous responsibility. But the vast majority of women were in their 50s, 60s, or even 70s.
And so just while we're speaking about that, I was kind of curious about any overlap between the women who attended the 1915 Hague Conference that we talked about a couple weeks ago, and the Paris Peace Conference.
So the vast majority of women who attended that 1915 Hague Conference of women that tried to seek a negotiated end to the war were the same women who then organized in Zurich. So the reason you had the women who gathered in Paris were only from the victorious powers. They were allied women, because women from the Central Powers could not go. They couldn't get visa or passports to go to Paris at this time. So you only had the victorious women represented in Paris. These women around Jane Addams, who had met in The Hague in 1915, were firmly of the belief that a lasting peace needed to be made by the victorious and the vanquished alike, as well as neutral powers. So they chose the neutral state of Switzerland for their meeting. And Jane Addams was there, Aletta Jacobs, whom you and I talked about, Teresa, who had organized that 1915 conference. She traveled by train down to Switzerland. Her memoir has a great story because, you know, you may not know it, but Germany had risen up in revolution at this time. Munich had briefly been taken over by Bolshevik or by communists, and they were traveling through Germany as all this was happening. And so they would get on trains that would stop in the middle of the nowhere in the dead of night because, you know, workers were simply walking off the job, and they had quite the journey getting down to Zurich. So some of the other American women too attended both of these conferences.
Thank you. So someone has asked, could you please tell us more about, you've mentioned her, Huda Shawari? Also, where did you do most of your research for such an international project?
Sure, yeah. So Hoda Sharawi is an extraordinary woman whose name I'd heard of, but I knew almost nothing about when I started this project. And I had a real months-long process of self-education and reading and consulting with experts to be able to write this chapter. Hoda Sharawi was born in Egypt in the late 19th century, again, to a very wealthy father, destined for a life of domesticity. When she was 13 years old, her family had her married to a much older cousin, a man in his 40s, because that was a strategy for keeping the family wealth intact. But it was a marriage that she deeply resented. And she was in a position to bring tutors into her own home. So that's how she pursued an education. There's complications in that marriage that allowed her a certain degree of freedom and when she was in her 20s. And so she was becoming more and more interested in social issues and in philanthropy as a young woman in her 20s and 30s. At the end of World War I, though, a number of prominent colonial nationalist figures were sought to kind of bring Britain to the table and end colonial occupation in Egypt. And her husband, whom she'd somewhat reconciled with, was one of these nationalist leaders. And so through him, she was at the table at these discussions about strategy of how do we oppose the British. The men kind of wanted the women in Egypt to serve as their helpmates. Hoda Sharawi and these other women said, we want to join you as equals. And so they began protesting in the streets. At one point, when they met a police force at gunpoint, Hoda Sharawi stood there in the street and dared them to shoot her and make her a martyr for the movement, and was kind of pulled back by her friends. And she went on to help organize boycott movements and petitions and to press for Egyptian self-determination, thinking and acting on the idea that women would be fully engaged as equals in this state that would form. In 1922, Egypt did win partial independence. 1923, they finalized their constitution and women were barred from voting, and most of the issues that women were most concerned about were pushed off the table. And so Hoda Sharawi turned around and founded the Egyptian Feminist Union, which was the largest and most active feminist organization in the Arab world, all the way up through World War II. She's quite an extraordinary figure.
And the other part of that was asking a little bit about the nature of your research.
Right, yeah. So I did research in person. I've kind of lost track. It was either 14 or 15 different archives and libraries around the world. Some here in the United States. Actually, the very first place that I started this project was in Boulder, Colorado, of all places. I know Boulder's been all our minds. It has a very warm spot in my heart. That's where the papers of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom are held. I did work in Washington, D.C. I did work in New York. And then I worked in a number of archives in Britain and in France and in Belgium. I did not do research in China or in Egypt. I don't have Chinese language skills or Arabic skills, but because Sumei Chang was constantly moving between the West and Asia. For example, she wrote 3 versions of her memoir. 1 was in French and 2 were in English. It wasn't until about 7 or 8 years ago that it was first translated into Chinese. So while I missed out definitely on some documents, I did have a Chinese historian who helped me with the ones I thought were most vital. And then this is a good, I think a good kind of archive research story. I was in the National Library in Paris, and they had an entry in their library catalog for a very, very famous feminist tract written by an Egyptian man in the late 19th century, but it said, I forget what the exact word was in the catalog, but more or less says with brief comments from Hoda Sharawi. So I knew that there was either an afterword or a preface that she wrote, but it's in Arabic. Even though it was in the French library, it was in Arabic. And I could not for the life of me tell by looking at the script whether it was at the front end of the book or the back end of the book. So I sat there in the library and essentially scanned the entire book and brought it back home until an Egyptian friend of mine here in Sacramento could help me look at it. And she said to me, I forget, I think it's in the preface or whatever it was the opposite of what I thought. And then she translated that document for me so that I could use it. So I have a small number of Arabic and Chinese language documents that I've used in there, but the vast majority were in French or German, a little bit in German or in English, and came from all these different archives in the United States and in Europe.
That's great. So Sally Beatty comments in regard to your story of Mary Church Terrell and the Women's League for Peace and Freedom not joining the resolution in regard to Black soldiers and young German women. And she wants to know if there were other suffragists that we would recognize who took major stances based on their personal experiences, both at the conference and in their home environments afterwards.
So basically wondering if there's other names that people would have heard of. Is that the heart of the question?
Well, others, I think what she's getting is others who would have been faced with some kind of controversy or issue that they needed to take a stand on. I don't know, she may be looking for, for those who had to take a stand outside the general position
of the suffragists.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure if this is going to answer the question exactly. I mean, to some degree, all these women were, acting on personal experiences. Hoda Sharawi being forced into this marriage at a young age. Sume Chung, her own mother, almost committed suicide because she was so despondent over the fact that her father had a whole second family with a concubine. And so, there were a lot of personal stories like that. If the question is more about African-American women in particular, that chapter actually focuses on two women. And I know Kenya was really interested in this. Mary Church Terrell is the best known of the two, but actually another woman is the focus of that chapter, named Ida Gibbs Hunt. She and Terrell were actually roommates at Oberlin College. Oops, sorry about my phone ringing there, people. Hopefully I have a family member who will grab it for me. So Ida Gibbs Hunt and Mary Church Terrell were roommates. Ida Gibbs Hunt was actually already in France during World War I. Her husband was had a consular office in southern France. He, again, one of the few African-American men to be trusted as a diplomat abroad. And she, much more than Mary Church Terrell, was very interested in Pan-Africanism and the idea of African peoples throughout the diaspora joining together with people from Africa in order to forward racial justice on a global level. And she came to Paris in 1919 to help her friend, the famous intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, to shape a Pan-African Congress, bringing representatives together from the Caribbean, from the United States, from Africa, in order to advance this agenda. She is much less known, and yet she is a powerhouse. And I know Kenya was really touched. She planned that. She really planned the Pan-African Congress. Let's be honest; it would not have happened without her contacts and her know-how and her French language skills. And yet, when it came to organizing the next Pan-African Congress after it was over, W.E.B. Du Bois sent an invitation to her husband and didn't send one to her. And man, was she pissed. And she let W.E.B. Du Bois know it. And so, she suffered sexual discrimination within the African-American civil rights movement. And that shaped how she thought about, political ideas and oppression and civil rights itself. You're muted.
Thank you. Yes. My computer just told me that. So there's still a little bit of time if anybody has a question. We've got a couple here. And then I'm going to ask you if you have any at the very end, if you have any final questions you wanted to ask Mona. So Sally Beatty also wanted to ask about your comments about the peace activist support for world health. And she asked, was that a worldwide phenomenon? And do you believe it has continued in response to other world conflicts?
I mean, there were others who had been calling for some sort of global health, integration, some way of coordinating before this. One of the American women who had come over to Paris in 1919, along with the Wilf woman, was a woman named Alice Hamilton, who was the first female doctor to have an appointment at Harvard University. And so she had a voice in talking about some of this stuff. But actually, another fabulous little story, the woman who actually stood up before the League of Nations Commission and kind of put forward the idea of a global health organization was a French woman, Dr. Gérard Mangin. Gérard Mangin is her hyphenated last name. But at the beginning of World War I, somehow somebody in the French bureaucracy saw her name and thought Gérard was Gerard and thought that she was a man. And so they drafted her into the army in World War I as a woman. She showed up. She said, great, I've got skills. They need them. She showed up at camp or whatever, and they all kind of didn't know what to do, but she immediately went to work. And so she was so helpful in this war context that she continued as an army medical officer, essentially, throughout the war. And when she went to present this before the League of Nations Commission, one of the men, she gave her little talk. One of the men, I think it was the Belgian delegate, said out loud, oh, was that woman a nurse? She's very beautiful. And the women turned around and said, she was not a nurse, she was a doctor, and you should take her seriously. So, you can see how the sexism kind of came in there.
So this follows a little bit on that. Someone wants to know why you think it took so long for French women to get the vote.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, French women never actually were given the vote by any type of popular appeal. It was kind of granted to them by Charles de Gaulle at the end of World War II. So in 1944 is when French women first gained the right to vote. This was a fairly familiar pattern in Southern Europe. Spanish women, French women, Italian women largely did not gain the right to vote in the interwar years, like many women in Northern Europe did. In France, in part, it had to do with sexism and all the same reasons that we're familiar with in the United States. Part of the issue that got complicated in France, though, was the fact that many Republican men, and not big R Republican, those who favored a republic, Democratic men, worried about giving women the right to vote because they were afraid that they would all vote for clerical candidates, so they were too Catholic, and that would sway the vote against the secular Republican majority. And so French women kept hitting up against that obstacle time and time again, and it helped delay their eventual suffrage.
Okay, so this last question comes from Rose Monhay again, and actually you may both have something to say about this. Have there been any efforts to include these women activists in mainstream history books used in school districts?
In school districts, I don't know. Actually, Kenya, you probably know better as an American historian. Has Mary Church Terrell started to work her way into any school textbooks, do you think?
If so, she's a tiny blurb. And I think that she would sort of go more along the lines of early turn of the 20th century civil rights efforts than including her amongst suffragists. And I think just really quickly, that's a fascinating question, because I did recently have a student ask, I think it was this past semester, say, were Black women interested in suffrage? Mm. And, there was no, malice. It wasn't a slight in any way. She says, I've never heard of a suffragist of color, ever. And so I would argue that even still, a lot of these women are not able to sort of break out of their shell of being civil rights activists over here, and as well be suffragists simultaneously. That's just not how textbooks seem to be written, in my perspective.
We probably should at least recommend the book Vanguard for people who are interested in the topic of African American suffragists. Vanguard's the title. I forget what the subtitle is, by Martha Jones. It just has come out in the last year and is it's written to be a very accessible story of many of these women.
And I think she was on a C-SPAN program that people might be able to Google and find on YouTube. Also, it was a great presentation. So can you, just to follow up on the school and teacher part of it and the school curriculum, could you say a few words about Gilder Lehrman, the Institute, your participation in that, and why that's important?
Yes, the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History goes around the country, and they train grade school level teachers in depth in these really wonderful institutes to just expand their understanding of US history, which was amazing. So I've been to Kansas twice to train teachers. And we sit in these large ballrooms and we have workshops. So in the morning, there's a historian, a professional historian who does sort of a lecture-based training. And then in the afternoon, they train teachers in how to integrate primary sources into their pedagogy. And it really is incredible. And of course, Gilder Lehrman also trains university level faculty as well. But it's probably one of the strongest organizations that I'm aware of to make sure that there is a heightened experience of US history education in a number of our grade schools nationwide. And I think they also give out awards in terms of master teachers and things like that. So if you're curious, if you're in the classroom, that might be a good institution to track down. They also have numbers of teaching aids that are available online for educators.
So did you have any last questions for?
I do. When you said I got another question, I got very excited. So we talked about, of course, this whole conversation has been about the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and suffragists and liberationists and their impacts. My question is, when this was all over, what was the impact of the Paris Peace Conference on these women and their movements, and how did they carry that on into the future?
So, I mean, women had many reasons to be disappointed at the end of 1919, right? I mean, they had much higher hopes than what was ultimately delivered. They did accomplish some very important and tangible results. So, for example, in the Treaty of Versailles that came out of the Paris Peace Conference, in the covenant of the League of Nations that formed this international government that would eventually become the UN that we still have today, there was an article in there, Article 7, that explicitly stated that all positions would be open to men and women on an equal basis in the League of Nations. That never would have been there or included had these women not been raising their voices. And so there are those, the Maternity Protection Convention of 1919, which again was the result of women's constant lobbying, called for women to be accorded a minimum of 6 weeks paid maternity leave upon the working women upon the birth of a child. That is a measure, a standard that's been met in every country in the developed world, except for the United States. So they had tangible results, but most of the things that they pushed for did not come to pass. And so, you'd think that they would kind of walk away despondent. What I really see is that women walked away empowered because, they hadn't succeeded in getting all the legislation and that type of thing passed that they wanted, but they had been heard, right? And they'd made headlines in the newspapers, whether they were disparaging or positive, they'd made those headlines. They were being seen, they were being heard, and they really saw a future in which they were going to be able to build on the activism that they had established. I argue in my book that this moment at the end of World War II really constituted the origins of global feminism. And that's, you know, international organizing among women had happened for decades before that, you know, going back to Susan B. Anthony and earlier European suffragists. But this was the moment in time, first of all, when women recognized that they could use the international arena in order to try and influence national laws and national customs, and began really looking at that as a mechanism for pushing reticent governments forward. Latin American feminists became absolutely expert at using this in the 1920s and 30s. Catherine Marino down at UCLA has written a brilliant book about these Latin American feminists. So that, and then also, while it would take a long, long time for women outside of the elite Western white circles to be able to be heard on anything like the same level as their white feminists, they did began pushing their way into broader international feminist organizations and also establishing their own regional, trans-Pacific, you know, Asian women's organizations, and began working across international lines in order to try and improve women's rights. And I think that those types of collaborations have only snowballed right up to the present day.
That's really incredible. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is that a good place to end for this? Did you have anything else, Kenny?
No, I'm not going to take up any more of Mona's time.
Well,
I know where to find her.
Yeah, I think that is a great place to end. And so I want to thank everybody for being with us this evening, and we hope to see you back again next week when Dr. Davis Hayes will have the challenge of moderating a discussion among all of our speakers over the past 6 weeks. So thank you again for being with us, and don't forget to support the Mission End Foundation when the museum and the tours restart. So thank you, and we'll see you next week. Have a good evening. Thank you to our 2 presenters today. This was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.